Galactic Council demanded Earth surrender. Humanity sent white noise. The Starforge Amphitheater holds 47 seats, and humanity occupies the lowest. Myra Shen sat motionless. Her hands were folded. Her notebook lay open, pages untouched. The chamber spiraled upward in tiers of stone and reinforced polymer, each level representing diplomatic weight, each height a small proclamation. You matter less than those above you. The humans had been placed at the base deliberately. Architect's intent, written into gravity and sight lines. The tea cooled beside her. Starling descent. The ceremonial brew served only during formal deliberations. Steam rose from the cup in thin, patient spirals. She had not touched it. 14 minutes had passed since the server placed it down. She did not notice the temperature had abandoned it. The luminous assembly occupied the upper middle tier. 9 photosynthetic entities, their bodies woven from bioluminescent tissue, had merged into a single speaking form for this session. Their colors shifted as they finished their declaration. Satisfaction rippled through their light. Humanity will surrender the genetic research archive on Kepler 442b. The assembly's voice came through harmonic pulses translated into standard. Complete sterilization of all research. Full genetic transparency to council oversight. Timeline: 90 days. Refusal constitutes violation of Accord 7731 and grounds for species-level sanctions. They sat back, their luminescence dimmed slightly. The vote was formality now. They had enough seats. 19 of the 47 delegations would follow their lead. The humans always lost when it came to votes on sovereignty. The chamber waited for the human response. No argument came, no negotiation, no surrender speech, just silence deep and certain, filling the amphitheater like water. Observer Prime Krell, the Velkar elder seated 4 tiers above the human section, shifted her upper 2 eyes toward Shen. Her lower 2 eyes continued scanning the chamber, independent, as Velkar eyes always moved. Krell had been fair in past sessions, predictable. She would call for further review, which meant the assembly's motion would pass. This was protocol. This was how it worked. Krell's 4 eyes remained separate, still independent. That was normal. Myra Shen rubbed the stone in her pocket once. Her grandmother's stone, worn smooth from centuries of handling, passed down through 5 generations. The weight of it was small. The meaning was not. She did not pull it out. No one saw. But something had shifted in her stillness. 72 hours prior. The encrypted transmission arrived without a header. No sender designation. No time stamp. Shen's quarters on the Nexus Station Prime were modest. A single room overlooking the docking bays where Earth supply vessels arrived quarterly. She was preparing the evening tea ritual when the console chimed. She nearly dropped the ceramic pot. Messages on secure channels did not arrive unmarked. Protocol required routing, authentication, verification. This one simply appeared on her screen, 3 paragraphs unsigned. The archive on Kepler 442b is not what the Assembly believes it is. We have been running a secondary protocol for 4 years. Every genetic sample we have stored has been intentionally corrupted with non-viable mutations. Nothing on that world will ever become sentient. We built redundancy into the redundancy. The Assembly has been looking at the public research library. They have never accessed the sealed archive. We have prepared for this moment since the first rumors of Accord 7730. 1. Enforcement began circulating. The second paragraph was a lie. Shen would understand this later. A deliberate false trail in case the message was intercepted. It claimed a backup archive existed on Europa Station. It did not. This was misdirection, beautiful and careful. The third paragraph was the only truth that mattered. If they demand surrender, give them nothing. Sit still. Let them speak into silence. No signature. The message deleted itself 3 seconds after she finished reading. Shen stood in her quarters for a long time. The tea continued steeping. The water temperature dropped. Neither fact registered. Her mind had moved to a different calculation entirely. She was junior, third diplomatic term, 28 years old, which meant she had joined the council's service when most humans were still learning institutional hierarchy. Ambassador Thorne was the primary delegate, experienced, respected. The human face the assembly knew. Thorne had tried negotiation before. Thorne had tried concession. Thorne had lost every time. But Thorne had sent this message. Unsigned, routed through untraceable channels, timed for 72 hours before the motion would be called to a vote. This was not impulse. This was preparation. Shen reached for the tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The human delegation occupied the lowest tier, and Shen's seat was the lowest point on that tier. Deliberate architecture. In a chamber built for sound to carry upward, her voice would reach the upper tiers diminished, defeated by simple physics. Unless, of course, she chose not to use her voice at all. Thorne sat in the observer booth behind her, rear chamber access, where secondary delegates and staff monitored sessions. He did not meet her eyes when she entered the amphitheater this morning, but his breathing was steady. His hands were unclenched. He had said one thing 4 hours before the session began. The moment you sit, everything changes. She had not asked what he meant. She already knew. Across the chamber, the Silicon Collective's lead delegate, a being of networked crystalline structures that hummed with internal processing, leaned toward his neighbor. The human appears frozen. Is this a medical condition? The neighbor, a trilobite coalition member whose exoskeleton clicked softly with each movement, made a sound that might have been amusement. Give it time. They always speak. They did always speak. That was the problem. In the Galactic Council, silence was not an option. Silence was surrender disguised as restraint. Except it was not silence born of fear. It was silence born of certainty. Shen had spent the last 72 hours in the archives, not the public ones. Those were open to all delegates. She had accessed the sealed historical library, the restricted sections where protocols from the last 160 years were catalogued. The Nexus Station Prime had been hosting the council since 2127. Every motion, every rule, every procedural clause had been recorded. Section 4C, Subsection 4C, added in 2247, unused for 80 years. Silence right to challenge. A delegate may invoke non-verbal refusal to comply with any motion. Said delegate must maintain perfect stillness for a minimum duration of 13 minutes. The chamber must grant a full audit of any claims related to the motion before proceeding to vote. This right may not be waived. The Assembly had written these rules. The Velkar had agreed to them. The Silicon Collective had signed off. Every species with voting weight had accepted this protection, designed to prevent rushed judgments, to slow down votes made in anger or haste. It had worked too well. It had protected them so thoroughly that they had forgotten they had written it. 80 years of forgetting. 80 years of believing certain procedures were obsolete. Shen pulled the archive text and committed it to memory, word for word. The ceremonial language, the exact conditions, the irreversible consequences. Ambassador Thorne had nodded when she showed him the clause. A single, slow nod. No words. They had said everything they needed to say without speaking. That was 3 days ago. Now, in the amphitheater, the Assembly's bioluminescence flickered with satisfaction. Their motion had passed the procedural review. The vote would be called within the hour. Shen sat perfectly still. The chamber had rules. Protocol governed everything. How delegates sat when they could speak, how long they could speak, what words they were permitted to use in formal declarations. The rules protected order. The rules also protected those who understood them most deeply. Myra Shen understood them very deeply. She had read the founding accords cover to cover. She had memorized the amendments. She had traced the genealogy of every procedural clause, understanding not just what each rule said but why it had been written, what vulnerability it was meant to close, what scenario it was designed to prevent. The Velkar, in their ancestral wisdom, had insisted on slow votes. They feared rushed judgment. They had written safeguards into the system, mechanisms to pause, to review, to examine claims before power was exercised. The Assembly had agreed. In 2247, they had even added a clause that allowed complete refusal to participate in a vote, silence as a legal right, noncompliance as a protected choice. They had written this rule to protect themselves from other species' sudden motions. Now that same rule existed to protect a junior human diplomat from their own demands. Shen sat. The tea cooled beside her. Minutes accumulated, first 3 minutes, then 6, then 9. The chamber began to shift in its seats. Velkar delegates conferred quietly with their neighbors, reviewing the exact wording of Accord 7731. The Trilobite coalition exchanged harmonic signals, clicks and pulses that might have been confusion. The Silicon Collective's optical sensors dimmed and brightened in rapid sequence, a sign of processing uncertainty. At 13 minutes, a crystalline delegate from the Lethian Commonwealth rose. "I move for full transparency audit," the harmonic voice said. "The human delegate has invoked silence right to challenge. We must examine all evidence related to the Kepler 442b archive before any vote proceeds. No delegate speaks until we have." The chamber erupted. Not in violence, that was forbidden in formal sessions, but in procedural chaos, delegates questioning whether the silence right to challenge even existed, others insisting it did, a frantic search of the official records, references to subsection 4C, questions about whether it applied to motions of this magnitude. It applied, it had always applied. The law was the law. Observer Prime Krell's 4 eyes, both upper eyes, both lower eyes, suddenly locked into perfect synchronization. This happened rarely. Velkar eyes moved independently by nature, each pair tracking different information, processing different angles. But when both sets locked, it meant something had shifted in her understanding. She had recognized what was happening, not just the procedural move, but the deeper truth beneath it. This was not silence born of fear. This was silence born of preparation. This was a delegate who had already won, sitting in the center of a room that had not yet understood they were walking into a space already emptied of the Assembly's leverage. The vote was postponed. The motion to audit the Kepler 442b archive passed with unexpected support. The Velkar voted in favor. Fairness demanded full examination. The Lethian Commonwealth pushed for transparency. Even 2 of the Silicon Collective's representatives abstained rather than oppose an audit. The Assembly's bioluminescence flickered erratically. Confused, they had expected compliance or argument. They had not expected refusal to register as legal resistance. Shen sat through it all without moving, without speaking, without a single gesture toward explanation. When the gavel fell, a bronze hammer struck by the first speaker, the decision was already made. The motion to adjourn and conduct the audit had passed. Protocol had been invoked. The Assembly would have access to the sealed archive. They would examine the genetic material with their own instruments. They would find nothing viable. They would find 4 years of intentional corruption, redundancy within redundancy, mutations designed to replicate natural decay, a ghost. Humanity had won without saying a word. Shen stood after 5 more seconds of silence. She reached down and picked up the cup of tea. It was cold now. Cold as asteroid dust, sitting where she had left it 41 minutes ago. She cradled it with both hands, not by accident but by ritual. This gesture would be noticed. This gesture would be remembered. She walked back to her seat without looking at anyone. Observer Prime Krell's 4 eyes remained locked in perfect synchronization. She leaned toward the archon of the Silicon Collective and whispered so quietly that only his neighboring auditory organs could register the sound. They were ready for us. We simply did not know we were walking into a room they had already left. The archon's optical sensors dimmed and brightened 3 times, a sign of intrigue, of respect, of recognition that the game had been played at a level the assembly was only beginning to understand. The stone in her pocket felt heavier now, or perhaps she was lighter. The distinction no longer mattered. Shen remained seated for 5 more seconds after the gavel fell. The Starforge amphitheater held its breath. 47 seats watched the human delegate who had sat in silence for 17 minutes and unmade an ultimatum without saying a single word. The assembly had expected her to collapse, to stand, to rage, to plead for mercy, for understanding, for time to explain. Instead, she had simply sat in the center of the chamber, cross-legged, her hands folded, her eyes locked on the bioluminescent form of her antagonists, and waited for them to understand what she had already known. The protocol was broken. The institution was cracking. The game had been won before the first word was ever spoken. Then she stood. The movement was deliberate, practiced. Every muscle in her body moved with the speed of a planet rotating. No rush, no fear, no tremor in her hands. She reached down and picked up her cup of tea, cold now, cold as asteroid dust, sitting where she had left it when she first sat down on the speaking platform nearly 40 minutes ago. Both her hands cradled it with the care of someone holding something sacred. This was not accidental. This was ritual completion. This was a statement made entirely without words. She walked back to the human delegation section without looking at anyone. Her footsteps were audible in the silence. Each step was measured. Each step was counted. Each step said what her voice had not said, what her voice would never need to say. The chamber did not move. The assembly's bioluminescence flickered in confused patterns, erratic pulses that indicated stress, confusion, the sensation of losing control of a situation that should have been entirely within their grasp. They had expected her to speak, to plead, to offer concessions, to negotiate, to perform the role of the smaller power begging for mercy from the greater. Instead, she had simply sat down and waited for them to understand that they were the ones being tested, that her silence was not submission but certainty, that she had already won, and everything that happened now was just the slow realization of a victory already achieved. Observer Prime Krell's 4 eyes followed her path across the amphitheater floor. All 4 eyes locked, synchronized. In her entire tenure on the council, spanning 43 years and 712 formal sessions, Krell's 4 eyes had never moved in unison during a formal proceeding. They moved independently by nature, by design, by the evolution of her species across millennia. Each eye tracked different information. Each eye processed different data. The synchronization was not natural. It was a tell. A crack in institutional certainty, a moment when the elder Velkar recognized that something unprecedented had occurred in this chamber, something that would be discussed in diplomatic circles for generations. Krell turned to the Archon of the Silicon Collective, her chamber neighbor. The two had sat beside each other for 43 council sessions spanning 3 standard years. They knew each other's breathing patterns, the precise timing of formal speeches, the weight of votes that mattered and votes that were purely ceremonial. They knew when a diplomatic shift had occurred. They knew when the ground had moved beneath the institution. "They were ready for us," Krell said quietly. Her voice carried no inflection of surprise or anger, only recognition, only the calm observation of someone who had just watched a master move in a game she had not known was being played at that level. "We simply didn't know. We were walking into a room they had already left." The Archon's optical sensors dimmed and brightened 3 times in rapid succession, a sign of intrigue, of respect, of recognition that the game had been played at a level the Council was only beginning to understand. The Assembly had moved like a chess piece pushed by an invisible hand. The Archon had voted for the Assembly's motion out of political alliance and institutional precedent. Now the Archon understood the vote had been meaningless from the moment Shen sat down on that platform. The outcome had been determined not by votes, but by certainty. Shen sat in her delegation seat. The cup of cold tea remained cradled in both her hands. She did not set it down. She did not place it on the table in front of her like a human delegate should. She held it the way one holds something that matters, something that carries weight beyond its physical mass, something sacred, something transformed. She raised it to her lips and drank. The gesture was visible to all 47 seats. No fanfare, no declaration, no speech followed by ceremonial gestures, just a human diplomat alone among the assembled galactic powers drinking cold tea in full view of the chamber that had tried to crush her world. The action was ordinary, completely ordinary, a diplomat drinking from a cup, but the context was not ordinary. The timing was not ordinary. The deliberation was not ordinary. Every species in the amphitheater understood that they had witnessed something that would be discussed in diplomatic circles for decades. Some would say a century. The younger delegates, the ones who had not yet learned to hide their reactions, visibly shifted in their seats. The Trilobite coalition exchanged urgent whispers. The Silicon collective sensors brightened with processing power, trying to calculate what had just happened, what leverage had been lost, what institutional ground had shifted. The luminous assembly's bioluminescence stabilized, not in satisfaction, but in careful calculation. Their primary speaker, the merged consciousness of 9 photosynthetic entities working as a single distributed intelligence, modulated their voice into frequencies designed to express measured composure. The sound was harmonic, layered with overtones that expressed both frustration and grudging acceptance. It was the sound of an institution recognizing its own constraint. "The motion is adopted," the assembly said, their voice filling the chamber. "We will convene in 48 hours for the full transparency audit. All species with voting weight will have access to the sealed Kepler 442b archive. We will examine the genetic material directly. Protocol mandates that we proceed with verification before any sanctions take effect." It was not capitulation, but it was constraint. The assembly had written the rules that now confined them. They had designed the procedures that now forced them to grant access to the very archive they had demanded be destroyed. The irony was not lost on Krell. She felt it settle into her bones like ancient weight, like the weight of understanding something you wish you did not know. The gavel fell. The session was adjourned. Shen remained seated for a moment longer, the empty cup still in her hands, her eyes closed. When she opened them, she looked at no one in particular. She simply gathered her notebook and stood to leave. Ambassador Thorne, still watching from the observer booth, allowed himself a single slow breath. He had sent the encrypted transmission 72 hours before the vote. 3 paragraphs. 2 of them were lies designed to be discovered. The third was the only truth that mattered, and now that truth had bent the entire institution around itself. The game was not over, but humanity had moved to a position of strength that had seemed impossible just hours before. 72 hours later, at precisely the scheduled time, the audit teams accessed the sealed archive on Kepler 442b. They found genetic material in various states of decay. Natural, inevitable, untouched by human hands. The presentient DNA samples had been systematically rendered inert through 4 layers of redundant mutation sequences designed to look like natural aging. Not one sample was viable. Not one could have produced a sentient being. The genetic mutations were so sophisticated, so carefully layered, that the decay appeared completely genuine. The research Dr. Soren Vex and his team had conducted for 4 years had been a ghost study, preparation disguised as protocol contingency hiding inside habit. The sealed archive that the assembly had believed contained the genuine research library was itself a trap. A beautiful, perfect trap constructed entirely from the assembly's own assumptions. They had assumed humans would hide the real research. They had assumed there was real research to hide. They had never considered that humanity might have prepared for this moment by corrupting the very thing the assembly feared most. The audit reports came back within 3 standard days. The findings were unanimous across all 47 voting species. No evidence of sentient species genetic engineering. No violation of Accord 7731. The genetic material was degraded, stable, and posed no threat to any species in the galactic community. The Assembly's case was demolished by their own inspection. Their ultimatum had been based on incomplete information. Their threat had been based on false assumptions. The vote that followed the audit was ceremonial. The Assembly withdrew their motion. The Council passed a formal recognition of humanity's research integrity. Humanity's delegation gained 2 additional seats in the amphitheater, seats positioned higher than before, no longer in the lowest tier. The humans would still be lower than the older species, but not by much. The symbolic shift was enormous. Shen sat at the observation window that overlooked the docking ring of Nexus Station Prime. Beyond the transparent aluminum, the stars held their positions. Earth was out there, somewhere beyond the usual visibility range, too distant to see directly with human eyes. But humanity's mark on the Council was no longer distant. It was here. It was held in the memory of Krell's synchronized eyes, in the confusion of the Assembly's bioluminescence, in the silence that 47 seats had witnessed and could not undo. The cup of cold tea sat beside her on the window ledge. She had not refilled it. She did not intend to drink from it again. It was complete now. Its purpose was served. The temperature had abandoned it entirely. The cup was just a cup. But it was also a record, a marker, a monument to a moment when one human decided that speaking would diminish what silence had accomplished. Days later, Shen returned to her quarters in the human section and brewed fresh tea. The ceremonial starling descent served only during formal deliberations and crucial negotiations. She let it cool. She watched the temperature abandon the cup minute by minute the way she had watched it abandon the cup in the amphitheater. 14 minutes, 17 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes. The longer she waited, the colder it became. The ritual was the point. The waiting was the meditation. The cooling was the transformation. She drank it anyway. This would become her discipline, a reminder that patience was not weakness, that silence was not surrender, that the longest game was not played with words but with understanding of the institutions that tried to crush you, understanding deeper and more complete than those who had written the rules themselves, understanding that if you knew the system better than the ones who built it, the system would rearrange itself around your certainty like water flowing around stone. The cup of cold tea was sent to the Human Delegation Archives. It was sealed in a preservation case with markers indicating its precise origin. The notation beside it read, "Ceremonial Vessel, Nexus Station Prime, Council Amphitheater, Session 4731. Witness to the silent challenge. Temperature maintained at ambient station conditions. Do not dispose." Younger diplomats who came after Shen would see that cup. They would ask about it. The story would be told and retold, each telling a little different, each version carrying a grain of the original truth. Some would say she held it for an hour. Some would say the tea never cooled at all. Some would say her silence broke the assemblies the moment she stood up to walk to the platform. Some would say she had planned every detail, including which color robes to wear, which moment to close her eyes, which breath to take before standing. The truth was simpler and more powerful than any of the stories. She sat. She waited. She drank cold tea in front of 47 species, and the galaxy rearranged itself around her certainty. Whenever a human delegate faced institutional pressure in the years that followed, they would brew the same tea. They would let it cool. They would drink it at room temperature as a ritual, a practice, a declaration of intent. The ritual spread throughout the human diplomatic corps. Other species noticed. The Velkar began brewing their own ceremonial drinks and letting them cool before formal deliberations. The Silicon Collective incorporated temperature-based timing into their voting protocols. What had started as one human's refusal to speak had become an institution unto itself, embedded in the fabric of galactic diplomacy. Krell never spoke of that day to the assembly. She did not need to. The four synchronized eyes had said everything that required saying. Certainty, when demonstrated so completely, needed no explanation, but she did speak of it to younger Velkar delegates. She told them about the human who understood protocol better than those who had written it. She told them about silence as a weapon. She told them that the strongest negotiators were those who had nothing left to lose or everything already won. The luminous assembly would never issue another ultimatum to humanity without first consulting the procedural archives extensively. They would never again assume that silence meant acceptance. They would remember, in their bioluminescent pulses, in the harmonic frequencies of their collective consciousness, that they had been outmaneuvered by a protocol they themselves had written. A rule they had designed to crush others, now turned inward with perfect precision. Shen stood at the observation window. The teacup beside her was still full. She had poured it 30 minutes ago and had not drunk from it. She was not watching the cup. She was not counting the minutes. She was simply present, simply patient, simply certain of what came next. The stone from her grandmother's pocket was now in her own pocket. She touched it once, a brief contact, a moment of acknowledgement. Her grandmother had taught her that the longest wars were fought in silence, that the strongest power was not in speaking. It was in knowing what you did not need to say. That preparation done in darkness, with patience that bordered on stone, would outlast any voice raised in anger or fear. She rubbed the stone once more. It was warm from her pocket, warmer than the tea, warmer than certainty, warm like something alive. Beyond the transparent aluminum, Earth waited. The Council waited. The galaxy waited to see if humanity had learned what the Assembly had finally come to understand. Silence, when wielded with certainty, was not the absence of power. It was power itself.